Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I think this is our last Alexander the Great video for Historia Civilis, at least for now, until he makes more. This is called the Battle of the Granicus. I think this has to do with the Anatolia Wars, the Persian War, the main war, right? So, yeah, thank you so much. Let's jump right in and see what we got.
It was May of the year 334 BCE, and Alexander the Great's invasion of the Persian Empire had just begun. For the moment, Alexander's stated goal was to pursue a policy of liberation for the Greek city-states living under Persian rule. At least, that's what he was telling everybody, and at this point, there was no reason to doubt him. As the Macedonian expedition into Asia kicked off, it was already at risk of drowning under its own weight. Somehow, they managed to send 47,000 people across the Hellespont, but this meant that they only had enough money to feed and pay them for about a month.
Right, so you gotta raid, gotta loot.
After that, the Macedonian state would become insolvent. Everything depended on immediately winning some kind of major victory, and using the spoils of that victory to finance the rest of the campaign. The whole endeavor was built on a financial house of cards. Alexander and the Macedonians began their campaign by marching on one of the larger regional cities. Capturing this city would solve their financial problem, at least in the short term. Alexander sent word that the Macedonians were here to liberate the city, only to receive word back that they were perfectly happy with
Oh, and we've seen this so many times in history. We're here to save you from your tyrants. You're here to save you from your tyrants. And they're like, I mean, you?
Persian governance. This was not a great start to the campaign. They were being told that the whole justification for their invasion was incorrect, and that the locals actually enjoyed the perks of living in the Persian Empire.
Wow. And think about think about that, the dictation of like Persian Empire. You have immediately when you hear that, you have like a few things you're thinking about. You're thinking about, you know, like Xerxes, you're thinking about a different world, East versus West. You're thinking about the combination of the Hellenistic world versus the, like I said, the Eastern world, and which is better. It's almost like a ancient West versus East version of world affairs. So it's so propagandized at the same time. But these people think that they're living in a decent place under a Persian Empire. That must have not connected in Alexander or the Macedonian minds. Like, what do you mean by that? Are you serious? There's no way you feel not like, what? Crazy.
Alexander didn't have the time or resources to invest in a proper siege, so he was forced to leave with his tail between his legs. One story claims that the locals bribed him to leave their city alone, but there's no way to verify this. With one setback under his belt, Alexander marched east. Along the way, small undefended villages surrendered to him, but this was purely symbolic. In order to really shake things up, the Macedonians would need to capture a major city, or win a decisive victory against the Persians. By the way, where were they?
Iraq.
While this was going on, a council of Persian governors were deciding how they should respond to the Macedonian invasion. One of the people invited to this meeting was a man named Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek national working for the Persians who was in charge of a division of Greek mercenaries.
And I'm sorry for pausing, but I'm just thinking, I think, is it Cyrus, the leader? I cannot remember.
Memnon was familiar with Macedon, and more importantly, he was familiar with the Macedonian economy. He knew that this tiny country must be bleeding itself dry in order to field an army of this size. With this in mind, Memnon advocated a scorched earth policy. Burn the crops, evacuate the towns, and pull back. Use the Persian fleet to cut the Macedonians off from the Greek mainland. By the end of the year, he argued, the Macedonians would be suing for peace
Not a bad tactic.
without the need for any bloodshed. The Persian governors looked at Memnon like he'd lost his damn mind. This Greek was advising them not to attack the invading Greek army. The governors rejected his advice. Instead, they decided to combine their forces and attack the Macedonians directly.
Okay.
By the way, history tells us that Memnon was nothing but loyal. A retreat would have been politically hard to justify, but his analysis was correct. A scorched earth policy would have confounded the Macedonian plans. Instead, the Persians were doing exactly what Alexander wanted them to do. Before too long, Alexander started to hear reports that there was a Persian army waiting for him near the Granicus River, only a day's march away. He immediately set out to meet them and arrived sometime in the mid-afternoon. The Persians had sensibly taken a defensive position on the other side of the river. The river was crossable on foot, but the banks were unusually muddy and steep. Climbing the banks of the river in the middle of a battle would totally mess up the Macedonian phalanxes, and would grind any potential cavalry charge to a halt.
Remember, the phalanxes are such a tight-knit group. They move slow, they move with discipline, so you can't really traverse a big old bank like this in that. You can't.
Estimates for the sizes of the two armies vary wildly in all directions, but the historical consensus is that the Macedonians had between 35 and 50,000 men, and that the Persians had between 35 and 40,000, giving the Macedonians a slight numerical advantage. My own personal theory is that the real Macedonian number was around 47,000, and that the discrepancy comes from some of the ancient sources forgetting to count the 10,000 Macedonians that were already in Asia, waiting for Alexander to arrive.
Right, remember they were already there, and they had, was this in Parmenius? I forget, was that his name? That's probably not his name.
Plus, we have reliable numbers from later battles, so you either have to argue that the Macedonian army magically grew over time, or that the army started out at the larger end of the spectrum. Anyways, reasonable people disagree, but in my opinion, the Macedonians had 47,000 men, and the Persians had between 35 and 40,000.
Okay.
Memnon of Rhodes was present with his 5,000 or 6,000 elite Greek mercenaries, but even with his help, the Persians knew that they were outclassed in the infantry department.
So the light blue is like the mercenaries.
However, they also had with them between 10 and 20,000 of some of the best heavy cavalry in the world, which was double or triple the number that Macedon had. The Persians placed their cavalry at the front of their line, ready to charge as soon as the Macedonians reached the bank of the river. They would hold their light infantry and Greek mercenaries in reserve. It was not entirely clear how the Macedonians should proceed. It was late in the day, and the Granicus River stood between them and the enemy. What should they do? Alexander's second-in-command, Parmenion, advised him to
Parmenion, not Parmenicus. Parmenion.
encamp for the night and wait. He argued that since the Macedonians had superior numbers, the Persians might want to pull back and wait for reinforcements. If so, the Macedonians should just let them. In Parmenion's opinion, attacking across a river was an unnecessary risk. Alexander responded, saying something like, "It would be a disgrace if, after crossing the Hellespont, this tiny river stood in our way for even a moment." He also went on about the courage and valor of the Macedonian people, blah blah blah, a bunch of nonsense. For the record, historians seriously disagree over whether or not this conversation actually took place. It pops up in one of our less reliable ancient sources, and it kicks off a pattern that repeats itself over and over again, where Alexander is faced with a problem, Parmenion suggests a rational solution, and Alexander does the exact opposite. Many have argued, and it's a legitimate argument, that we're not really supposed to take these conversations at face value, but instead see them more as a literary device created by the author to highlight Alexander's unique style of leadership. So, if we're not sure that this conversation happened, why did I include it here? Well, if Parmenion wasn't giving this kind of advice, he definitely should have been. Attacking across a river after a long day's march is a very bad idea. Parmenion knew this, but his advice went unheeded. Alexander ordered an immediate attack across the river. The Macedonians deployed for battle, with their heavy infantry in the center, and their companion cavalry on the wings. The king would take command of the right flank, and Parmenion would take command of the left. The Persians could see Alexander, with his distinctive armor and his bodyguards, and repositioned some of their own cavalry in response. Alexander initiated the battle by ordering his center to advance, sending his heavy infantry and some cavalry into the river. The Persians hit the Macedonians with every arrow at their disposal as they slowly made their way across the river. Then, on the Macedonian right, Alexander charged with his companion cavalry. Parmenion, on the left, did the same. But unlike Parmenion, Alexander and his cavalry didn't go straight across the river.
Went at an angle.
Instead, they crossed at a sharp angle, ignoring the enemy opposite them and heading straight for the Persian center.
To relieve his infantry from the volley fire.
When they got up the bank of the river, they charged. Suddenly, the Macedonian companion cavalry, led by the king himself, were in the midst of the Persian lines, fighting in all directions at once. There was a violent, chaotic struggle. One source describes the cavalry being crammed so tightly together that they were fighting more like infantry, standing still and hacking away with their swords and spears in order to make incremental gains. Alexander was right there in the middle of this. His ancient
very risky
Trojan shield took several direct hits, and his distinctive armor attracted a lot of Persian attention. At some point, Alexander's spear snapped, and he had to grab another one from his bodyguard. It was intense. It wasn't long before a second wave of Persian cavalry arrived to reinforce the center. Alexander rallied the companions and charged for a second time. Mid-charge, somebody threw a javelin right at the king, but Alexander managed to catch it with his Trojan shield. He yanked the javelin free and then charged straight at the person who threw it, one of the enemy cavalry commanders. Alexander and the Persian cavalry commander met on the battlefield. Alexander's spear took the Persian in the chest, puncturing his armor and wounding the rider. The impact snapped the tip off of Alexander's spear, rendering the weapon useless. Although he was wounded, the cavalry commander stayed on his horse. Sword in hand, he prepared to strike Alexander down, who was basically just sitting there holding a big stick. As a last resort, Alexander gave one final thrust with his broken spear. Macedonians were deadly accurate with these weapons, and it paid off here, because the splintered end of the spear hit the Persian rider right in the face, knocking him off his horse. Alexander's victory was short-lived, because while he was doing this, another Persian came up behind him, lodging his sword into the back of the king's head, cutting clean through his helmet and into his scalp. Dazed, Alexander was somehow able to draw his own sword and kill his attacker. While his back was turned, a third Persian rider charged.
Jeez, this guy's just getting, like, cleanup crew on him. Where's his bodyguards? They're all fired at this point.
Sword in the air, ready to kill the king. At the last moment, one of Alexander's personal bodyguards
finally showed up to work,
named Cletus the Black, which is just the best name ever, cut the guy's arm off, saving the king's life. Alexander's personal bodyguards rallied to his side and fought some kind of defensive action around the king. Our sources don't explicitly say why this happened, but some people believe that it's because Alexander fell unconscious. This makes the most sense to me, but I want to make it clear that none of our ancient sources actually say this. While Alexander was perhaps unconscious on the—
he was more or less probably dazed. He could have been unconscious. I don't want to discount that. Because think about, like, it could almost be the shock and awe of what happened. Like, that force of, if this is all accurate, and the sword actually went through, hit his helmet, and then took maybe a tiny piece of his head with his scalp, that's going to, just the impact is going to concuss you a little bit. It would feel like that would give you a little bit of daze and confusion, shock and awe. So maybe this was like to rally and confirm that he's okay. He's their king. Now, remember, he is like the closest thing to God that they have.
On the ground, the Macedonian heavy infantry were still trickling across the river. Just take a moment to appreciate how much of a disaster this was. Their king was wounded, perhaps unconscious, perhaps even dying, they didn't know, and the majority of the Macedonian army had yet to join the battle. Parmenion was right. Alexander's charge across the river had indeed been reckless, and one could argue, downright stupid. But say what you will about Alexander's recklessness, the Companion Cavalry did create enough space for the Macedonian infantry to get themselves across the river. Once they were back in formation, they slowly began to push the Persian cavalry back. Now that the infantry was in the fight, the Companion Cavalry got a few minutes to recover. In no time at all, Alexander was back up on his horse again. The Persian center was beginning to cave, which meant that it was time to commit their reserves. The Greek mercenaries were well disciplined and held their own, but the Persian light infantry were inexperienced and ill-equipped. The Macedonian phalanxes continued to gain ground. At this key moment, Parmenion, who had been conservatively fighting on the left this entire time, led an incredibly well-timed cavalry charge. This sent most of the Persians into a full rout. The elite Greek mercenaries, however, would not budge. The exhausted Macedonian phalanxes ground to a halt. Alexander, still addled from taking a sword to the head, attempted to rally the army by leading a third and final cavalry charge against the Greek mercenaries. During this charge, Alexander's horse was killed, and the king was thrown to the ground for
He is going through it.
a second time. Hopefully, at this point, somebody told him to take a knee and cool it with the near-death experiences.
Yeah, it's twice in like
The final
10
bit
minutes,
of
30
fighting
minutes.
was tough, but the outcome was inevitable. The Greek mercenaries couldn't take on the entire Macedonian army. They eventually surrendered.
That's it.
Let's talk about losses. All of the 5,000 or 6,000 Greek mercenaries were killed or captured. But because of this, the Macedonians never had a chance to pursue the fleeing Persians, which made their losses remarkably small. Only around 2,500 Persian cavalry were killed. We don't know how many Persian light infantry were lost, but probably not that many, since they were held back for most of the battle. The Persian defeat was decisive, and yet over 3/4 of their army escaped. They got lucky. The Macedonian losses were even smaller than that. According to our sources, it's possible that as few as 150 Macedonians were killed.
That seems a little small.
That number sounds way too low, and
Yeah.
it probably is. Again, our sources suck, but bear in mind that 10 times that number would have been wounded as well. Whatever the real number is, it's remarkable that so few Macedonians were lost. It's even more remarkable considering how the king's recklessness almost got him killed multiple times. Alexander was victorious, but he still had massive financial problems. Remember, he had repealed taxation back home, and the entire apparatus of state was basically running off of the spoils of conquest. He looted the enemy camp and sent whatever treasure he could find back home, but frankly, there wasn't much there. In desperation, he enslaved the captured Greek mercenaries and sent them back to Macedon to work in the mines. Enslaving his fellow Greeks was not good PR, considering that the whole justification for this
Well, I mean, you can propagandize anything. They were fighting for the enemy in his eyes.
war was the liberation of the Greek people. Anyways, the spoils from the Battle of the Granicus did buy Alexander a few more months. If he could use that time to capture a major city, his financial problems would go away. This was achievable, since the Western Persian Empire now stood largely undefended. However, success brought with it new problems. What had begun as a minor border issue had become an existential threat to the Persian Empire. Darius III of Persia,
Darius, not Cyrus.
King of Kings, finally took notice and ordered an army assembled so that he could meet this threat personally.
Ooh. And that's crazy. That's just crazy. Look at all that land. It's just crazy how massive the Persian army was, or Persian Empire was. And then this is immediately going to become the Macedonian Empire, and then immediately it's going to break out into 3 or 4 slices immediately after Alexander's death. Now I'm not sure. Now since we're done with this, what an amazing feat of sending it. That's the best way I could say. He just sent it across that river. Um, just a display of, once you get into, that's the thing. Like, I think Alexander knew, like, once they were in the heat of battle, his army was better. So that was the point, to engage in battle. And once we're in battle, he knows that he's going to win. That was the hypothesis, I believe. As far as like this series goes, I'm thinking this is it. I don't know. I'll have to check. So I'll put an asterisk on that. I don't think there's another Alexander video from Historia Civilis. If there is, let me know. I'll check too, but let me know. We've done we've also done a full series through Epic History on Alexander, but I know there's channels out there that might cover it a little bit more granular, battle by battle, for the whole campaign, which he never lost. He never lost the battle, which makes him probably the greatest general of all time. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out. Bye bye.